I'd like to welcome you all this evening to the first in a series of lectures that the Center will be sponsoring this year. Tonight we are delighted to welcome back to Boston College Professor Alan Berger, who holds the Raddock Eminent Scholars Chair for Holocaust Studies, the first such chair established in the state of Florida, and he also directs the Holocaust and Judaic Studies BA program and the Center for the Study of Values and Violence After Auschwitz at Florida Atlantic University. He's written many books and is well known in the field of Holocaust research. Some of his titles include Crisis and Covenant, The Holocaust in American Jewish Fiction. More recently, Children of Job, American Second-Generation Witnesses to the Holocaust. And this was the first systematic study of films and novels of children of Holocaust survivors. He also edited with his wife Naomi a volume called Second Generation Voices, Reflections by Children of Holocaust Survivors and Perpetrators, which won the B'nai Zion National Media Award. We're delighted to have Alan join us again this evening, where he will fill us in on some of his more recent research. The topic, or the title for this evening, is The Moral Minority, Altruism, Rescue, and the Human Condition, Lessons from the Holocaust. Please join me in welcoming Professor Alan Berger.
Thank you very much, Phil, and it's nice to be back here with you and Dr. Langer, and to see some old friends. I'm delighted to do that. Well, let me see. Before I start, I want to take off my watch, and you know when a professor takes his watch off, it means nothing, absolutely nothing. What I want to do tonight is to share with you some perspectives on altruism, what it is, how was it expressed during the Holocaust, can one educate for altruism or pro-social behavior, to talk about Oskar Schindler, about whom you know something, but there's much more to be known than you probably know already. And to talk a little bit about what kind of lessons we might learn from the rescuers. But before I begin, I want to give kind of an overview so that we may be on the same page, so to speak. And if there are questions afterwards, I will try to do what I can about answering them. The daughter of a high-ranking aid official during the war said this in reflecting on her own experience during that terrible period. A few thousand righteous, a few million dead, and a few 100 million Europeans. It all remains inconceivable, inasmuch as one dares to think about it at all. Can we, the heirs of that generation, pass judgment? Or can we only mourn? History proves that it is possible to fight evil. During the Holocaust, the answer to Cain's question, am I my brother's keeper, was a resounding no, for the most part. This no to life was articulated both by bystanders and by perpetrators. In the words of Herman Broder, Isaac Bashevis Singer's protagonist in his novel Enemies, a Love Story, and I quote, Cain continues to murder Abel. Only in the 20th century, the killing was not done by a rock smashed into a skull, but by vast gas chambers by an industrial process to mass produce dead Jews. But what does it mean to be one's brother's or sister's keeper? On a fundamental level, it means to respect human dignity, to see one's own face in the face of the other. But 2/3 of European Jewry perished, owing to the fact that their non-Jewish neighbors viewed them as residing outside the universe of moral obligation. The demographics here, I think, are quite revealing and serve to underscore the precariousness of the Jewish situation. During the war years, there were approximately 300 million non-Jewish Europeans. While the precise number of helpers will never be known, perhaps 250,000 were Chasidei Umot Ha'olam, the righteous among the nations. That is, those who acted altruistically and without payment, their sole purpose being to save Jewish lives. As of this moment, there are approximately 20,000 people who have been recognized by Yad Vashem, Israel's national monument for historical archives about and research on the Holocaust. Just by way of an historical note, Judaism has long recognized the righteous among the nations. These nations were the non-Israelite tribes of biblical times. But in fact, the Bible records the first act, or an early act of altruism, reporting that the Pharaoh's daughter, acting against her father's desire or decree to drown all male Hebrew babies, saved the infant Moses, who in fact was the first hidden child in Jewish history. Although nameless in the Bible, later rabbis named the Pharaoh's daughter Batya, daughter of God. Specifically concerning the Shoah, Professor Martin Gilbert, in his book The Righteous, reports a post-Holocaust Passover ritual in which Jews recall the names of Shifra and Puach, the two Egyptian midwives who also defied the Pharaoh's order to drown all male Israelite children. These moral beacons of light in the night to which Europe had descended, although few in number, reveal that the path to altruistic behavior has many corridors. Some viewers acted alone. Others, such as the villagers of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, acted collectively, although in secret. In Belgium, there was a strong Jewish self-help, the Comité de Défense des Juifs, the CDJ, which, with the help of many Belgian non-Jews, placed as many as 4,000 Jewish children in hiding, and possibly 10,000 adults, many of which joined the resistance. Incidentally, if you ever have a chance to see a film called As If It Were Yesterday by Esther Hoffenberg and Miriam Abramowitz, please do so. This film talks about rescue in Belgium. And there's one scene in there that is really quite special. One of the directors of the CDJ, Monsieur Ibert, recalls placing this youngster, maybe 5 years old, with a peasant family. And the times then were very precarious, both for those who were hunted and for those who helped them. One day, Ibert received a call from the host family, "Come and take this child away immediately. We no longer want him." "Why?" asked Monsieur Ibert. "Well," the farmer said, "he is a thief." "What did he do?" "He stole the Jesus icon from our Christmas creche." Ibert went immediately to the place where the child was hidden and asked him what he had done. And at first the child said, "Nothing. I haven't done anything." And Ibert spoke to him, as he says, man to man, and said, look, if the Nazis find us, you know they will kill us. Now, please tell me what you did. So the little boy said, well, I knew that Jesus was Jewish, and that if the Nazis found him, they'd kill him. So I took the statue and I hid it. So Monsieur Ibert explained this to the family, and the couple warmly embraced the child with tears in their eyes and kept him. But that was an exception to the general rule in occupied Europe. In addition to Belgium, where there was organized rescue, there also was a similar phenomenon in Poland, what you might call the belly of the beast. There, the organization was a national organization called Zegota, Z-E-G-O-T-A. It was dedicated to the rescue of Jews. But even those rescuers who acted alone had lots of help. What do I mean by that? If you read Victor Klemperer's autobiography and also the writings of Elizabeth Maxwell, you will discover that every Jew who was hidden was obligated to at least 10 people. Now, the degree of obligation varied. It may be that someone heard that a Jew needed a hiding place and passed that information on to someone else, who then took other appropriate steps. So it was always more than just one person helping one Jew. What were some of the motivations which prompted altruistic behavior? I think this is a question which deserves some attention. Some acted out of a sense of Christian duty. Others because they felt it was the human thing to do. Some whose salvific actions upheld the sanctity of human existence, but they were secularists without any formal religious training or even religious inclination. Still others were motivated by nationalistic feelings. Perhaps the most bizarre phenomenon among the types of helpers were anti-Semitic rescuers, which at first seems like an oxymoron. But Nechama Tech, in her book, Dry Tears, talks about this, the anti-Semitic rescuer. How does that work? Well, to simplify, but I hope not oversimplify, the anti-Semitic rescuer would say, these are our Jews, and you can't do what you wish with them or to them. We can, but you can't. How many people in here have a dog? Okay, so most of you have good sense. But the analogy would be like saying, this is my dog. You can't kick my dog. I can, but you can't. So don't kick my dog. Who were some of the other people who rescued? Well, some were in highly placed sensitive positions, such as diplomats. For example, all of you, I'm sure, have heard of Sugihara, Senpei Sugihara, the so-called Japanese Oskar Schindler, who was his government's consul in Kovno, Lithuania, and also de Souza Mendes, Portuguese consul in Bordeaux. Each of them acted specifically against their government's demands that they stay out of the thing. Each of them suffered official disgrace after the war. Both were dismissed by their governments. Now, what can we say about this? Sugihara first. Japan is home to neither large numbers of Jews nor Christians. What would motivate him? Well, Sugihara was profoundly moved at the human level by the plight of the Jews whom he saw around him. They were lined up at the gate of the Japanese consulate, waiting for exit visas. He wrote them. Nearly half a century afterward, Sugihara himself reflected on his reasons for helping the Jews, and I quote, "They were human beings and they needed help. I'm glad I found the strength to make the decision to give it to them." So Sugihara's motivation arose from a type of secular humanism. D'Souza Mendes was moved by Christian principles. For him, the choice was stark yet simple. His government, although officially neutral during the war, did not wish to do anything that would provoke Nazi Germany. His children recall their father saying, quote, "I cannot allow these people to die. Our Constitution says that the religion or the politics of a foreigner shall not be used to deny him refuge in Portugal. I have decided to follow this principle, even if I am discharged. I can only act as a Christian as my conscience tells me." And here's the key line. "If I am disobeying orders, I would rather be with God against men than with men against God." An interesting sentiment. Then there was another consul, Selahattin Ülkümen, the Turkish consul on the island of Rhodes, was responsible for saving some 42 Sephardic Jews. Unlike his colleagues, Ülkümen remained in his country's diplomatic service, was not put in official disgrace. Nothing happened to him. Asked why he risked his life to save Jews, he told an interviewer that although he did not know any Jews in Rhodes, as a university student in Turkey, he had many Jewish friends. He did not discriminate between Jews and Muslims. "I didn't ask what their religion was. I had no special ties with Jews. I only had humanitarian feelings toward every human being. If they had been black people or brown people, I would have done the same thing." So thus far, what we can see emerging is some relying on their Christian principles, some relying on their humanistic principles. Now, before we get all charged up and ready to go out and spread the message, let's remember that altruistic behavior is a very complex issue. About the Christian message of love of the neighbor, you know that there were 4 Einsatzgruppen, 4 special action killing squads. The leader of Einsatzgruppe C, Ernst Bieber, was, prior to the war, a Protestant minister. Einsatzgruppe C, incidentally, was the killing squad that was responsible for the murders at Babi Yar, 33,000 Jews in 2 days. Bieber, unhappily from his perspective, missed that one, but joined the unit in time to happily join in the murder of thousands of others. He was not a bloodthirsty man, incidentally. But lest we think it was only religion that failed, secular humanism did not fare too well either. The leader of Einsatzgruppe D, Otto Ohlendorf, had a PhD in economics. There is plenty to feel ashamed about when you think of the Holocaust. We, I think, all believe, know something about the meaning of altruism, an act done without expectation of reward. But there is one other stipulation. There must be a very high possibility of great personal risk to the helper. But not everyone agrees that altruism is even possible. Anna Freud, for example, dismissed the possibility of altruism because, quote, The givers enjoy the act of giving. The satisfaction they derive from helping others belies the selflessness of their acts. You know, academics usually don't get it. André Trachme, pastor in the village of Le Chambon, I think offers a more helpful definition of altruism. He says the following: help must never be given for the sake of propaganda. Help must be given only for the benefit of the people being helped, not for the benefit of some church or other organization that is doing the helping. Now here's another example, not from Pastor Trachme, but from his wife, Magda. Magda Trachme was bewildered over the consternation she caused her neighbors when policemen came to arrest her husband. Pastor Trachme was a pacifist and had a long history of pacifism, and he was arrested by the Nazis. He subsequently was let go. But in any case, when the police came to arrest her husband, guess what Magda Trachme did? She served them dinner, saying, "I don't understand. It was dinner time." What more natural thing would you do than serve people dinner at dinner time? I want to share with you a couple of theories of altruism, and then we'll move along. Nechama Tek, who herself was a hidden child in Poland and is now a distinguished professor of sociology at the University of Connecticut and has written many important books, including a pioneering study of altruism when light pierced the darkness, distinguishes two types of altruism, normative and autonomous. Normative altruism is that kind of behavior which the society demands and rewards. For example, helping an older person across the street, assuming they want to go, is rewarded and expected by society. That's normative. There's a second kind of altruism called autonomous. Autonomous. This is selfless help. It goes counter to the norms of society. And the risks are graded risks. They start with social ostracism. It goes to physical injury and escalates to death, not only for oneself, but for one's family. And remember that during the Holocaust, it was legal to kill Jews. It was illegal to help them. By helping them, you were actually breaking the law. Now, some of the other theories of altruism that seem to be prominent and current are those by David Blumenthal, a professor at Emory University, who argues that two key factors facilitate the doing of good and evil. One is insertion into a hierarchy which does or tolerates good or evil. And the second is patterns of childhood discipline. There is another very important book about altruism, Theories of Altruism, written by Samuel and Pearl Oliner. The Oliners have suggested three characteristics that go into the making, you might say, of an altruistic personality. One is family background. How is the child raised? What kind of tolerance or intolerance was shown in the home? Second, the circumstances. What circumstances was the person thrust into that would demand that she or he act in a certain way? And third, what about the personality of the individual? All of these are worthy of our attention. But I want to return, at least briefly, to Nechama Tek's suggestions And she says there are 4 shared traits among altruistic people, or 4 shared traits among the rescuers. 1, marginality, which Tech clarifies as indicating a sense of individuality or separateness. That's what she means by marginality. 2, a high level of independence and self-reliance, which enabled the rescuers to pursue goals regardless of how others viewed these goals. Well, so far, numbers 1 and 2, marginality and a high level of independence and self-reliance, also could apply to successful criminals. If you think about it, why not? 3, the fact that their efforts were unplanned in the beginning, that is to say, they didn't sit down and think, well, here's how I'm going to act over the next 3-year period. And perhaps the most important, a universalistic perception of the needy. This enabled rescuers, Tech argues, to disregard and set aside all attitudes of the needy except their dependence and helplessness. The fact that you were needy was the most important fact about you. Nothing else mattered. Now, can altruism be taught? I can give you my own response even before I get to the end of my remarks by giving you a definitive maybe. Definitive maybe. Douglas Huneke, who has written very extensively on in this field and wrote a book called The Moses of Rovno, which talks about an incredible rescuer, lists 7 characteristics or traits which can be used to educate for pro-social behavior. 1 is an empathetic imagination. 2 is the ability to present oneself and control a critical situation. We might call it self-confidence, to cut to the chase. 3, a previewing for a purposeful life. Does one have moral goals when one sets out on the course of life? 4, a personal pre-war experience of suffering and death, which in fact leads you or helps you to have an empathic imagination. 5, the ability to confront and manage prejudices. Think of that the next time you're watching a BC football game and they're losing. Number 6, the development of a community of compassion and support. And finally, the ability to offer hospitality. Almost all of these go back to what the Oleners would call childhood training. What kind of home did you come from? What kind of outreach, or what kind of hospitality, or what kind of interaction with others did you witness as a child? Now, I want to talk a bit about what Harold Schulweis, Rabbi Schulweis, has suggested. He urges the developing of a passion for a double memory of the worst and the best, a double memory. This means that the names of the Gentile murderers are accompanied by those of the Gentile rescuers. Although Schulweis's admonition was addressed specifically to the Jewish community, I think it holds with equal or even greater force for Gentiles. It is important to remember both. Among the rescuers, none is more complex than the German industrialist Oskar Schindler. He was a lapsed Catholic, a bon vivant, a war profiteer, a Nazi Party member, a womanizer, an alcoholic, a chronic briber, and a double agent. Hardly the resume you would expect if you were investigating or interviewing candidates for altruistic behavior. However, he saved 1,200 Jewish lives. If one's name was on the list, then one had a possibility of surviving. Schindler was the oldest child and only son of his parents. His mother was a staunch Catholic. His father spent a lot of time in bars. Oskar Schindler himself went to a German-speaking school until his expulsion for riding his motorcycle through town. Schindler's next-door neighbor, however, was a rabbi, a Reform rabbi, Dr. Felix Cantor, whose two sons were Oscar's grammar school compatriots. So he knew Jews from an early age. Several events, both personal and historic, happened early on in Schindler's life. He got married, and he married Emily, who was a staunch Catholic, who had in fact received at least part of her education in a convent. And Schindler recalls that he told her that as a child, she remembers defending the defenseless, including gypsies and the town prostitute. Her best friend, Rita Gross, was Jewish, and Rita wound up being murdered in Auschwitz. Oskar, however, true to form, began straying from his marriage almost from the beginning. Although he and his wife were childless, Oskar had fathered twins by the time the war began, and fathered yet another illegitimate child after the war. So he was busy on a variety of fronts. The historical event that most impacted on Schindler was, of course, the rise of the Nazi Party. Oskar was many things, but he was not a Nazi. He wore the Hakenkreuz, the swastika in his emblem, an emblem in his lapel, because he knew it was good for business. He was selling tractor parts. And if he walked into a store or a merchant and he had the lapel pin on, then he was likely to make a sale. He was charming, he was intelligent, he was resourceful, he was a double agent. He acted as a courier between the Jewish committee in Hungary and the Jews who were, in fact, incarcerated in his camp. He was very active. Schindler went to Poland immediately after the Nazi invasion, not to save lives, but to make a profit, which he did in the beginning. However, Schindler's career started, it ended by him becoming a rescuer. In the beginning, he made a fortune out of the Jewish labor. By the time of the end of the war, he lost a fortune by protecting the Jews. So what happened? Well, at least part of what happened is that he witnessed an action, a cleansing, as the Nazis euphemistically called it, of the ghetto. He, in fact, was horseback riding with his mistress that day, and he witnessed the murder of perhaps 2,000 people. And it moved him deeply. He was not a confirmed National Socialist. He was a person who responded to the situation. Schindler was also a master briber. He relished his role as a saver, as a conniver. Schindler was, to use the medieval Latin term, a macher. He was able to wheel and deal. He was able to outwit the enemy at their own game. He enjoyed it. I had the privilege of interviewing several of the Schindler Juden, people whose names were on his list who live in Boca Raton, at least in the winter, which is a good move. And they all agree that he thoroughly enjoyed outwitting the Nazis. And he also had a great amount of compassion. Rena Finder, one of his Jews, told me that he would leave cigarettes at various spots on the floor in the factory. He would take one or two puffs and leave them there for the workers to finish. He would have some of the women prisoners clean his office after it was already cleaned. In other words, he let them sit there and rest for a couple of hours. So he was a man of great compassion. He, for example, took delight in giving bottles of vodka to the low-level functionaries who were guarding the prisoners, so the guards would become drunk and they wouldn't care about or pay much attention to what was happening on their watch. There was an episode, I don't know how many of you saw the film Schindler's List, which brought to the phenomenon of the rescuer to public attention, but of course, as with all Hollywood films, had great distortion. You recall at the end, Schindler looking at his Mercedes and weeping and saying, "Oh, if only I'd sold this car, how many more Jews could I have saved?" One of the Schindler Juden whom I interviewed said, "Oh yeah, can you imagine Schindler every time he dealt with the Nazis, if he started to break down and weep and sob, he'd really get very far, wouldn't he?" That wasn't Schindler. What was Schindler, however, was this man of incredible compassion. There was a scene in the movie when you saw a boxcar loaded with Jews, some of whom had died, frozen to death. And Schindler had the corpses removed and buried according to Jewish tradition. A rabbi who was a prisoner in the camp led the services. Schindler paid for the upkeep of the grave. So what can we say about Schindler? He had no use for organized religion. He wasn't a very learned man, but he was able to discern right from wrong. A womanizer, yes. Many affairs, yes. But morally, he was a hero because he saved lives. So this is one of the complexities I think we have to deal with when we talk about Schindler and we talk about altruism. Being an altruist, being a moral hero, doesn't mean that you're morally infallible. It means that you know the preciousness of human life. Now, for those of you who are married, don't go home and tell your spouse that you're a moral hero and, by the way, I've been sleeping with your best friend. That's not the message of Schindler. The message of Schindler is, are you able to discern the meaning of the sacrality of human life? Now, Schindler was a responder. He saw what was happening and he said, "This is not right. I must do what I can to stop it." He was also a gambler. He liked to outwit the system. Before the war in his hometown, he was known as a swindler. And he was. And his greatest delight was to screw up the Nazi system. And he did it beautifully. He really did. Schindler also had a variety of helpers, including some of his girlfriends, one of whom bailed him out of prison, including some of the other Nazi officials who were sick and disgusted of what was being done in their name. There was an SS Colonel Erich Lang, who was instrumental in helping Schindler in a variety of ways, including implementing his request to move his Jews, he always called them his Jews, to Brinlitz, which was in Slovakia. So, Schindler was ideally situated. He was an industrialist, he had important connections in the armaments industry, and he was a great expert at bribing. All of this helped him. There were others who were not so well placed. They were individuals, like Sofia Bania in Poland, who had to conceal the fact from her husband that at first that she was hiding Jews. And many people who were rescuers knew Jews before the war. They worked together, they worked for Jews, they shopped in Jewish groceries, etc. Sofia Bania hid a family, a husband and a wife. And the husband would have long talks with Sophia's husband about politics, about what was happening on the international scene. And the husband, in turn, would go and visit with his Gentile friends and impress them with his great knowledge of world politics. So here is a kind of double way of helping. Incidentally, there's a film that you want to see about this. It's called So Many Miracles. A wonderful film. Now, what can we say about the legacy of helpers? What are the lessons? The legacy or the contemporary implications of altruism. Well, one is very sad. Evil evidently is assumed. It's taken for granted. Altruistic behavior is seen as so special that we have to devote books and articles and chapters and symposia and speeches to the topic. Gee, why do we behave good when that's not our nature? We're really pretty lousy at heart. So that's one of the lessons. It compels us to rethink the human condition. Or as Elie Wiesel has said, the mystery of good far exceeds that of evil. All of the rescuers have in common that they refuse to see themselves as heroic. They think that what they did is nothing special. I did what anybody else would do. Perhaps it is left to the untutored Madame Brott, Marie Brott, in Le Chambon to give us this lesson. Although the Jews did not believe in the Gospels, they are still God's people. And your theology isn't worth anything, she said, unless it leads to action, which is true. In those days, Wiesel says, one reached the summit of humanity simply by remaining human. What an indictment. All of the rescuers wished that they could have done more. If you think about that, they don't see themselves as heroic. Each of them wish they could have done more. It resonates with what you read in the Hebrew Bible, the difference between a true prophet and a false prophet. The true prophet is always one who thinks himself unworthy. And incidentally, the prophecies do come true. But thinks of himself as unworthy. The false prophet is a different matter. Learning what distinguishes the altruists, those who took action, from those who stood by and did nothing or actively participated, will also have some important things to tell us. There's also the role of gender in altruism during the Holocaust. Frequently, it was the woman who was the first to answer the knock on the door. It certainly was the case in the overwhelming majority of examples. There's a very good book by Michael Phayer and Eve Fleischner called Cries in the Night. It was the woman who typically made the initial decision. Am I going to let this person in? Am I going to give him or her food, tea, water? And from that flowed the rest. Also, the role of religion is problematized here. I remember last century being at a conference in Washington, D.C., and it was a conference that was honoring the rescuers. And I was sitting next to this Danish gentleman who had been a rescuer during the war. And I said to him, well, I guess the role, religion played a very large part in your decision to rescue. And he said, nah, in Denmark we have these lovely churches, but they're all empty. We helped the Jews because they were fellow citizens. Fellow citizens. Religion had nothing to do with it. We have suggested that it's possible to teach altruism, maybe. But there are also some other considerations that I want to finish up with here. One is, and I'm sure most of you have heard about this, the Milgram experiments. Do you know about that one? Stanley Milgram's obedience to authority. Well, briefly, it was an experiment conducted by a man in a white coat. And the victim was part of the experiment, only the other people who were part of it didn't know that. The victim was seated in another room, and the volunteer was brought in to meet the victim, was told that the victim had just recovered from a heart attack. Okay. Then the volunteer was placed in front of a control panel and told to ask a series of questions of the victim. Every time the victim got a right answer, it was fine. Every time the victim got the wrong answer, then the volunteer would turn up the electricity, giving a jolt, he thought, to the victim. Of course, no such jolt happened. And there's a film of this. One man in particular comes to my mind, smoking a cigarette, giving the jolt to the victim, and the victim would scream out, "Oh, no, stop, you're hurting me." And the volunteer would say, "Well, gee, I can't do this because he's saying I'm hurting him." And the man in the white coat said simply, didn't argue with the guy, said, "Well, the experiment calls for you to administer more voltage." And the volunteer said, "Well, yeah, but the guy is screaming and yelling and I can't do it." And the guy in the white coat says, "Yeah, but, this is what the experiment calls for." And the volunteer takes a drag on a cigarette and says, "Okay, but it's your responsibility." Now, it's true that there were variables here. And when the victim was not behind a partition but closer to the volunteer, there were fewer people who were willing to continue administering the jolt. So that's one thing. Secondly, some of you may have heard of the Riceville, Iowa experiment conducted by Mrs. Jane Elliott, a third-grade teacher who wanted to teach her kids about prejudice and violence and hatred. So she arbitrarily said, okay, everybody with brown eyes is good, and you sit here. The rest of you are bad, and you sit on the outside of the circle. And the kids began to believe that. And then one of the more exciting one, the Princeton experiment. A bunch of seminarians at Princeton were told to prepare a lesson on the parable of the Good Samaritan. Luke, chapter 10, verses 29 through 37. There were three groups of seminarians. Those that were told to be in a high hurry to get to the chapel to preach their sermon, those that were told that they were in an intermediate hurry, and those that were told that they were in a low hurry. Now, on the way to the chapel, there was yet another victim, in quotation marks, suffering a heart attack, feigning a heart attack. Well, these were seminarians talking about the parable of the Good Samaritan. What were the results? 60% did not stop. And these were not trying times. Of the 40% who did stop, 10 were in the high hurry, 45 in the intermediate hurry, and 63 in the low hurry. So if I have time, I'll help you. But, I just can't do that now. So I hope you survive your heart attack, but I can't help you. Now, there's something else that I think is even greater in terms of a risk to altruistic behavior. And that is, there seems to be something about modernity itself that encourages the murder of the other. Zygmunt Bauman has written very eloquently about this. He says that ever since modernity, the advent of modernity, there's a fatal split between reason on the one hand and morality on the other. What does that mean? It's not rational to put your life on the line. It's the moral thing, but it's not the rational thing. So Bauman concludes two things. Morality is not safe in the hands of reason, though this is exactly what the spokesmen of reason proclaim or promise. So what are we doing about the societal managers and society itself? We pride ourselves on being reasonable. But if Bauman's argument is correct, the more reasonable we are, the less likely we are to act morally. Modernity then presents us with this rather fatal contradiction between doing the reasonable thing and doing the moral thing. We might say that we are now experiencing, at least in part, the societal production of moral indifference. Now, Bauman takes heart in the fact that even given this, there were still rescuers, still people who acted altruistically. I would say, what is the lesson? Well, we have to try to act altruistically. We have to be pro-social because the alternative is too bleak. And the times demand a moral role of us. The very fact that there were people who acted in a pro-social way in the kingdom of night means that one person could save a life, the actions of one person. It means that not everybody was engulfed by the poison of anti-Semitism and racism and hatred. Altruism can be taught, but it takes a partnership between the home, the school, and society at large. But then we come back to the example of Oskar Schindler, and I think with this I'll stop. Oskar Schindler, his wife said, was fortunate to live in a time which could use his unique talents. Neither before the war nor after the war, Oskar was able to do anything morally superior. After the war, you don't know this from watching Schindler's List, but there is a documentary made by a British filmmaker about Schindler. And there is the autobiography of Emily Schindler, his wife. After the war, Oskar, Emily, and his mistress all went to Central America. I think they probably lived unhappily there for a while. Oskar came back to Germany. His wife, incidentally, called him, and this is a direct quote, an asshole. But who was that? After all, it was she who accompanied him after the war. But the point is that Schindler was a moral hero as a responder. André Trocmé, the village of Le Chambon pastor, was a moral idealist. The difference between responder and idealist is the difference between one who commits one's entire life to a moral outlook, who is deeply involved and committed to bettering the human condition. Before the First World War, André Trocmé was a committed pacifist. He was sent to Le Chambon by the parent church in order to get him out of the way. What damage can the guy do there? You know, Le Chambon is a village about 300 miles south and west of Paris, and the Chambonnais were Huguenots, Protestants who themselves were used to being outsiders, to being marginalized. So, responder or idealist, the fact remains that in the instant of need, when we're faced with a challenge, not of loaning somebody money or borrowing a car, but of saving a life, the pro-social folks, the righteous, have left us with a question that is always going to be with us. What would I have done in that situation? Thank you.